I'm Marya Shakil. Welcome to this special edition of News Epicentre this Saturday. 30 years ago, today 1991, the government of India under P.V. Narasimha Rao ushered in significant reforms for the Indian economy. It abolished the intricate system of controls of the license Raj that gave the state primacy in almost all aspects of business and daily life, with no breathing space for enterprise. Former Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh, in the avatar of Finance Minister, presented the first budget of the Narasimha Rao government, and the economy welcomed the liberalization drive, rebooting consumerism and entrepreneurship at a time when the economy was on the verge of collapse. Over the last 3 decades, successive governments have followed this path to catapult the nation to a $3 trillion economy and into the league of the world's largest economies. More importantly, nearly 300 million Indians have been lifted out of poverty and hundreds of millions of new jobs have been provided for the youth. The reforms unleash the spirit of free enterprise, which has helped produce world-class companies and help India emerge as a global power in many sectors. We are currently in the middle of a pandemic, which has dealt a serious blow to the economy. Has the reform drive established the fundamentals that can put us back on track? How have the 30 years changed India, and where do we go from here? I have economists and policymakers who have chronicled the journey of the country post-1991 in their books. Joining me on the show, N.K. Singh, 15th Finance Commission Chairman, Gurcharan Das, economist. We'll be also joined by, I can see Shankar Iyer as well, author of multiple books. Mr. Singh, you were a core member of the 1991 reform team. In the Portraits of Power, you spoke about your experiences of working with the team. Did planning and implementation go hand in hand, or were there any discrepancies? And tell us, are we ahead or behind of what we planned in 1991?
That's a very intricate question, Marya, if I may say so. Because when it comes to economic reforms, one must recognize that there is only a departure, not an arrival. It's an ongoing dynamic process. A tectonic shift was made in 1991. It had been preceded by years of fiscal profligacy and hesitation on account of the baggage of a particular mindset which had gripped the inheritors and the planners in their initial decades. So 1991 did represent a shift. It's a debatable issue. What was a mix of compulsion and how much of it was conviction? How much of it was borne out by the compulsions of the time? Dr. Manmohan Singh himself has rightly today, in a piece which he has written, talked about the proximate circumstances, which the compelling circumstances, which led to the 1991 reforms. But thereafter, it has been a meandering process. There have been periods of great lull. There have been periods of great spurt. I think that the implementation also faltered because, having negotiated the quarterly performance criteria and having negotiated with the structural reform benchmarks, there were many areas where action had to wait for a long time. Give you 2 examples. Examples most important being, we had agreed in between 1991 and 1993, the adoption of a GST type of taxation. It took a number of years with the Modi government to have introduced a GST in a version which was visualized at that time. We are, of course, going through a lot of teething problems, which is inevitable, and we need to improve on that. But that's for another matter. Give you another example. We had talked at that time about far-reaching farm law reforms. It has taken a long time before those reforms to take place. We had talked about changes in the power and electricity sector. Till today, at best, it can be said it's a work in progress. Okay. And of course, as we meandered along, you got spurts, but you got periods of stagnant change. You got periods followed by after that period of the Atal Bihari Vajpayee period, which I've also had the privilege to chronicle in my autobiography, where the big shift in the telecom reforms took place, the shift in road connectivity and so on. So it has been an ongoing dynamic, and a new momentum has been given in the last few years under the leadership of the current government.
Let me
It's
bring
not a question of UPA or NDA. These kind of comparisons get into the politics of it. I'm talking from the economic point of view.
Yes, that's right. So let me bring Shankar now. Okay, Shankar, in Accidental India, you have said that the 7 turning points in the country's history were not the result of foresight or careful planning, but were rather accidental consequences of major crises that had to be resolved at any cost, including 1991 reforms. What were the tradition-defying accidents the country witnessed post-1991 reforms?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the last part of it, Marya?
Yes. I want to know what are these accidents that have happened post-1991 reforms?
Well, NK was there in the first team of the 1991 accidental reform, and he was there in the opening up of many sectors. In 2002, he argued for opening up of FDI late when he was member planning commission. So India's change always is propelled by an exogenous force. Every foreign direct investment opening has been pushed by a crisis. The lessons that, Marya, that we should learn from this is that when the crisis arrives, you have to be ready with a leadership, with intent and a team. The 1991 reforms worked because Narasimha Rao led from the front, and he had a team of terrific bureaucrats, people who were invested in the future of India. There were people like N.K. Montek, S. Venkataraman, C. Rangarajan, Amarnath Verma. There's a legion of people, Dr. Y.V. Reddy. And always remember, institutions have to be led by individuals, and the caliber of people matters. Similarly, during the Vajpayee era, you had the caliber of politicians, the ministers, the kind of exchange of ideas that led to many of the ideas. You can say the Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan, the universalization of midday meal scheme, the Prime Minister's road project, which NK was involved, the highways project, all of these were pushed by a team of people. In the UPA era, the first part of and a capable team. The second part was lost in din of noise of corruption. Mr. Modi's government, again, in the first term, did spectacularly by improving financial inclusion, rural electrification, and the likes. But it seems to have lost the momentum. And also, this brings back to the idea that excessive centralization has its own fallout and own drawbacks. There is a statute of limitations that functions when one person or a dependence on one person. So every program that Mr. Modi drives is a success. The rest of the ministries, we don't know where it's going.
Okay, let me get the opening comments also from Gurcharan Das, and I'm going to refer to his book also. Gurcharan Das, in India Unbound, you talked about India's economic growth. Most of it has proven profitable despite the global recession of 2008, 2009 and massive scandals and scams in the last 2 decades. How did you take into consideration all the things that were yet to happen? Is it that the corruption and scam almost like is seen as automatically comes into the calculation because of the demography that we have?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a great day today. And, I'll even go further than what you have done or NK and Shankar have said. I feel that we didn't win our independence in 1947, but we finally got it in 91. We got independence in 47, but we got enslaved very quickly in the license Raj, and we lost 2 generations after that. So this was a very, very big event. And now I think the question is the real problem that both NK and Shankar have tried to grapple with is caused by the fact that none of the leaders none of the reformers have sold the reforms. And people in India still cannot distinguish between being pro-market and pro-business. They think only the reforms will make the rich richer and the poor poorer. And the reality is the opposite. And so, I mean, this is why it's good to remember what Margaret Thatcher said, that she used to spend only 20% of her time doing the reforms and 80% selling the reforms. Why did the agricultural reforms fail or they haven't taken off? I'm so glad that we haven't gone back totally on them, but the reality is that they should have been sold, and therefore every government has been reforming by stealth. Chori, chori, chupke, chupke. Now that's not the way to do it. And I blame, frankly, all the reformers. And and we had hoped that Modi would be a different animal, that he would be a reformer, but he has turned out to be not a reformer. The government state still meddles with too much. And the Modi's government is just as steep in socialism and welfareism.
Okay.
But really, the bigger disappointment was Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, who should have really been the person, and night after night, selling the reforms. Now, the key thing I think that I want to say, my hope is for the future that it's in the digital revolution. Just as the IT revolution created millions of jobs for India and lifted a lot of people up, I'm hoping that this new economy, which is capable of it has a tremendous potential for job creation. But, I feel very upset that actually the government is today trying to kill this. I mean, you've got to give them credit for the jam trinity, but take the behavior on e-commerce. It's got such a huge potential for exports, for the small companies who can actually make their products available to the world. That's not the jobs are going to be those kinds of jobs, not be delivery boys. That's what people make the mistake.
Yes. So while I'll spend a little more time on this, Mr. Singh, one of the impediment in success of liberalization, many would say, is lack of enough skilled manpower in India. According to an estimate, just over 5% of our workforce has undergone any kind of skilling compared to us. If you look at South Korea has 96% workforce with skill training, Japan at 80%, UK has around 68%. Don't you think we have to do much more on this front?
Well, there can be no two opinions on that. But let me make, just with your indulgence, Marya, a small comment on something Gulsharan said, with which I totally agree about selling the matrix of economic reforms. It's exceedingly important to have a wide stakeholder consultations and wide stakeholder ability to be able to take this forward. Now, you see, take the case of agricultural reforms, for instance. Three successive governments before Mr. Modi sought to put forward the same changes in the Agricultural Produce Marketing Act, and it was therefore a very long process of consultations, which was not coming to a fruition when this kind of a decisive step, I would say a somewhat audacious step, was being taken by panache by Prime Minister Modi. But I want to come back to the question which you have asked. There is no doubt that the use of digital technology, which has been mentioned by Gulsharan, is the future. In my view, the use of 5G will have a dramatic multiplier effect in segments of the economy, in agriculture, in education, in healthcare, which requires immediate redressal. So the faster adoption, fiber optical cable and assured fiber optical cable linkage is not only important for curbing inequalities, which have crept up, particularly during the pandemic, but in terms of the gains of productivity being substantially improved. And that can be harmonized with the skilling thing which you are mentioning.
Okay.
And if the skills necessary for ushering in a genuine digital revolution is to be done, then the pedagogy needs to be harmonized with the culture of skilling.
Okay.
And I hope that in the implementation, and I agree with Gulsharan that the implementation is critical. Shankar also mentioned about the implementation. It is important that when the NEP, the new education policy, which has come after 30 years since the earlier one, we will spend a lot of time in being able to inculcate a culture in which the pedagogy is altered with inculcating artificial intelligence, machine learning, and the ability of that right from the school curriculum.
Yes.
And that would be an important mindset change with which we'll have great multiplier benefits in the future.
So, Mr. Das, we are also seeing that in the last 10 years, a new breed of entrepreneurs have come up. A breed of first-generation businessmen that don't come with their pockets full of their grandparents' money. Where do you place this startup generation in India's journey of economic growth? What do you think about the government support or lack of it to this startup culture?
Well, I
really think that the startup culture needs nurturing, needs fostering, needs incentivization. And this must go far beyond the limited one on the productivity-linked incentives and some tax concessions which are being given for startups.
Okay, Gurcharan Das, your thought also on this one.
Innovation.
I think that that's really the hope. I mean, what India has is entrepreneurship. And one of the reasons why the reforms of 91 had begun is that we had entrepreneurs ready and they were ready to run. And at that time, they served, they built great companies at that time. Now, what we have is an even better situation. But all we want is the government to step out of the way. My worry is that, I know the words they keep talking, there's Startup India and all that. But when you have parts of the government meddling with, policies, creating that kind of uncertainty that they are creating in e-commerce, for example, I feel the poor entrepreneur, it was before the license Raj. It was before, now, they made some steps in ease of doing business. And the reason our ranking has gone up in the world in ease of doing business is basically digital, that we have reduced the interface of the officer with the individual. Now, the culture that we want is the lower bureaucracy, which is really the bane of the individual entrepreneur.
Okay.
And that's what, I really can't say this more strongly.
Okay.
But I must tell you that I think that we are on the right track.
Okay.
We are going to get out of, COVID has been a horrendous setback.
Yes.
But I think we will recover
I'll take that to Shankar Iyer. Shankar, you have said India is governed by Newton's law, where governments and governance remain in a state of inertia unless impacted by an external force. If we consider the pandemic as that force, how do you see the government's move on the economic front in the last 1 year? What the government should do to improve the picture as more COVID waves are expected?
So, the government's approach has been hesitant, incremental. I would have expected the biggest move that they made was on the farm laws. But as a political party, the BJP rules in 15 states. They could have had, C. Subramaniam made Green Revolution happen by creating demonstration farms across India. Why couldn't the BJP ruled states create the demonstration effect of the viability of these farm laws? The problem is that the constituency for reforms in India is in Delhi and the rest of the country is paying lip service. We have a strong political consensus for weak reforms. Unless that changes, we can't do much. Secondly, I want to add to the issue of skills that you spoke about. No country in the world has prospered without investing in human development We spend less than 1% on health and less than 3% on education. This simply cannot sustain. You cannot produce people who can be taught skills if they spend less than 5 years in school. This is delusional if you think that that can happen. I think the government at the center and the political parties need to make the states now the focus of reforms. Every factor of productivity, land, labor, all of it lies in the states, and the states have to reform. And that is the conversation that is missing in the narrative.
Let me give the final words to N.K. Singh. N.K. Singh, you know, this is something that's often seen from the political prism. In China, private entrepreneurship is doggedly backed by the communist government, and the result is for all of us to see. Contrast that to India. Whenever government has attempted to back any private companies, it becomes a suspect with massive opposition to any such move. Don't you feel private-public partnership will determine our economic success?
Well, thanks, Marya. I'll just make 3 very brief comments. First of all, I think that, yes, we require a mindset change for a more meaningful public-private partnership, which you mentioned. Indeed, one of the redeeming features of the last budget is at long last, and I'm sure Gurcharan will appreciate this, we are saying goodbye to ownership of public sector undertakings. The new philosophy of public sector undertakings is that government will vacate the space and, except in some strategic areas, will really walk out, allowing private capital to come in. This, by the way, includes the untouchable subject of privatizing 2 banks by way of a pilot thing, and hope that the multiplier effects will really build on that. My second quick comment is, Shankar, I totally agree with you that the next stage of economic reforms and that the next venue of economic reforms cannot be Delhi. It has to be Lucknow, Patna, it has to be in Bhopal, and that a state-centric approach is necessary for even taking forward the reform agenda which has been undertaken in multiple ways, but particularly on factors of production, land, labor, capital, in terms of more inclusive banking, in terms of the engagement of the 3rd tier of the government. And on the health and education, I agree that it is a pity that expenditure reprioritization has not occurred in a manner which would be meaningful for really assigning less than 1% of GDP to health is really very tragic. It should be at least 3%. Education outlays need to go up, but then government revenues must equally go up. The tax GDP ratio today is abysmally low, which circumscribes government's expenditure options. And expenditure reforms, tax reforms must go hand in hand with necessary priority to areas like health and education, which correctly was pointed out both by Shankar and, of course, by Gurcharan. So I would say that these are the critical areas of reform, making digital revolution tangible. And Gurcharan, let me end on a slightly lighter note, which might please you entirely. And with your permission, Marya, in one of the incidents which I have recounted in my autobiography, I mentioned about a meeting of late Atal Bihari Vajpayee in Blair House in the United States, when he had called all the leaders of the Indian tech, the Vinod Khosla, Rajiv Chandrasekhar, those people who were the leaders in the Silicon Valley, and they asked, what is one wish which you have? One wish which they have, please do not have a telecom ministry, because we have grown, because we have been unshackled, don't shackle us by the Damocles sword of a ministry, but having a very light-handed regulation in the entire area of digital and telecom is the way forward.
Thank you so much, N.K. Singh, Gurcharan Das and Shankar Raya. Thank you for sharing your experience and your ideas for our economy. Of course, 30 years since 1991. Today certainly is a historic day. That's all from me. Thanks so much for watching.